Thank you. Ruth Maguire, Convener of Equalities and Human Rights. Ms Maguire, please.
Thank you. Good morning, First Minister. Scotland faces a number of significant challenges to human rights protections, and one of those challenges is Brexit. My committee heard from Professor Alan Miller, Chair of your Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership, during evidence on our inquiry into human rights in the Scottish Parliament. He told the committee that the closest thing to a constitution in Scotland are the two pillars in the Scotland Act, and these pillars require compliance with EU legislation and the ECHR. He said removal of one pillar, EU compliance, and I'll quote now, imperils our continuing adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights. Professor Miller believed a new framework would be needed post-Brexit. Now, First Minister, I'm not asking you to preempt the results of the advisory group, but I'd be interested to hear your views on the needs for the Scottish Government to carry out human rights impact assessments to ensure that human rights and a culture of human rights can be systematically mainstreamed and embedded into law, policy, practices, procedures and priorities of the Government.
First Minister.
Well, I think it's a really important question. As you say, there's key formal mechanisms at the moment that effectively embed a human rights approach. One of those is the need to make sure that the legislation of the Scottish Parliament abides by ECHR requirements. Obviously, public bodies more generally have to act in a way that's compliant with convention rights, whether that comes through the Human Rights Act route. Brexit is a real risk to this, and it's something I've discussed with Professor Miller on a couple of occasions, more than a couple of occasions. As you know, I asked him to convene the leadership group, which is really been asked to look at three things. Firstly, how we make sure that if Scotland is outside of the European Union at any stage, then we don't fall behind current European human rights protections. Secondly, how we, even if we weren't in the EU, would keep pace with any developments in EU legislation. And thirdly, how we can make sure that whatever our constitutional arrangements, whether we're in or out of the EU, Scotland is a world leader in human rights. And Alan Miller's group is due to report to me by the end of this year, and I'm sure your committee will have a great interest in the recommendations he makes. In terms of human rights assessments, I'm very much of the view we should embed that approach in all of our policy making. We need to, and I think there's some good examples of how the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament are already doing this. The social security legislation is one where we embed a human rights approach right at the start of the policy-making process. Looking ahead, that's going to be really important as we incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, because the success of these kind of things is not in how many court actions are brought to enforce compliance. It's about whether we avoid that because we've embedded human rights at the outset. So I'm a huge supporter of that approach and want to see us put human rights right at the centre of everything we do.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank you for that answer. The committee's work and the Scottish Government's advisory group have been focusing on human rights ambition and leadership. First Minister, do you agree that these assessments shouldn't only focus on impact but also identify opportunities, for example by giving a more concrete expression to particular human rights standards, implementing a court judgment on human rights, or a recommendation from the UK's Universal Periodic Review, or UN treaty bodies or reports from special rapporteurs?
First Minister.
In short, I would agree that these are the kind of judgments and measurements that we should be looking at to assess whether our approach to human rights is changing people's experience of whether it's public services or social and economic rights. And that, for me, means embedding it right at the start of the policy-making process. Often we see human rights in terms of people having the right to sort of take action when their rights are breached, and that's important. Of course it is, but actually a proper approach to human rights would be ensuring that everything we do, whether it's legislation or policy, respects human rights from the start, so that people don't need to be in that position. And all of the tools that you've talked about there are really important in making sure that we measure properly whether we're living up to that. I think Scotland has got a really good story to tell around its work in human rights, but I want to see us remain at a leading edge of this, and I think both the work Professor Miller's group is doing and the work your committee is involved in will help make sure that's the case.
Thank you.